In the last tutorial, we learned that the notebook programming environment combines the documentation capabilities of a traditional paper-bound lab notebook with the coding capabilities of a conventional programming environment like a text editor. Paper-bound lab notebooks have been used successfully by renowned scientists and inventors for hundreds of years, and text editors are used today by some of the world's best coders. So, why do we need digital notebooks? What can we do with a digital notebook that we can't do with either a traditional paper-bound lab notebook or with a conventional programming environment? Well, let's find out. Welcome to Doggo.jl, where I explore the vast Julia wilderness and turn my discoveries into wholesome Julia tutorials. I'm assuming that you watched the last tutorial, and that you have both Julia and Pluto loaded on your computer. Let's start by firing up the Julia REPL and launching Pluto. You can do that with a single line of code. Next, let's create a new notebook and title it Pluto Markdown Cheat Sheet. Remember, you can create a header by using a single hashtag character. This is optional, but I'm going to customize this user interface like I did in the last tutorial. You can create a slightly smaller header by using 2 hashtag characters. Before getting to any Markdown text, let's get comfortable with some of the keyboard shortcuts provided by Pluto. Recall that you can see a list of the keyboard shortcuts by hitting F1. You can hit Ctrl-Enter multiple times to add multiple cells. You can use Shift-Enter to execute the code in a cell without adding a new cell. Ctrl-C copies the entire line of code to your clipboard. Ctrl-V pastes the contents of the clipboard. You still need to use Shift-Enter to execute the code that you just pasted. Ctrl-X cuts the code in the cell, but keeps the cell. Notice that the output remains, even after you cut the code. You can update your notebook manually by using Ctrl-S. Ctrl-S will update your notebook in memory, but not on disk. Notice that the output is now gone. In order to save this file to disk, you need to use one of the export options, which we'll do later. When it comes to deleting a blank cell, you have a couple of options. One of the options is to use backspace. You can also use the delete key. You can navigate between the cells by using either the page up or page down buttons. Ctrl-M is the keyboard shortcut to add the template code for Markdown. By default, Pluto uses a pair of triple quotes for Markdown, but it works just fine if you use a pair of single quotes. So that does it for keyboard shortcuts. Now, let's talk headers. As you've already seen, you can use the hashtag character to create headers with different font sizes. There are 6 different sizes for headers. Here are a couple more examples. When it comes to formatting standard Markdown text, you have a couple of options. You can use italicized text by using a pair of asterisks. You can also use bold text by using a pair of double asterisks. You can also include a black quote. In order to use a black quote, use the greater than character at the beginning of your black quote. For the text, I'm going to copy some text from the Pluto.jl GitHub page to use as an example. Of course, feel free to use your own text here. As you can see, the black quote is set apart from the rest of the notebook. In addition to the black quote, You can also include a code block. In order to include a code block, use a pair of triple backticks. This isn't actual Julia code. It's just Markdown text that emulates the look of code displayed in a terminal window. You can also insert this coding format in line by using a pair of single backticks. As you can see, the font for print line is different than the rest of the Markdown text. Okay, let's move on to lists. There are several ways that you can create lists in Pluto. One option is to use numbers. Another option is to use the asterisk character. As you can see, using the asterisk character generates a list with bullet points. You can also use Markdown to create tables. The syntax for a table uses a combination of vertical bars and hyphens, so it's a bit cumbersome, but it does work. Speaking of hyphens, you can add a horizontal rule by using 3 hyphens. When using Markdown, the backslash character is used as an escape character that has a number of useful purposes. Here's how to include the quotation mark character. The $sign is used for several different purposes within Markdown. So if you want to display a literal $sign, you need to use the backslash character immediately before it. You can also use the backslash character to force a new line. You can use Unicode characters with Markdown. Here are a couple of examples. You need to use the Tab key to convert the Unicode character into the actual character. When you hit Tab, Pluto will provide you with some options. All you need to do is hit Enter to select the Unicode character to display. You can also inject HTML/CSS code into your notebook. In order to do that, use HTML instead of MD and use a pair of triple quotes. Pretty cool, right? Let's wrap up this Markdown section by taking a look at some multimedia examples. You can include hyperlinks. The syntax for a hyperlink is a pair of square brackets followed by a pair of parentheses. The hyperlink text goes in between the square brackets, and the URL goes in between the parentheses. I'm going to use the link to Pluto's GitHub page as an example, but feel free to try some other websites. As you can see, this link will take you to Pluto's GitHub page. You can use a similar syntax to include a static image hosted on the web. The only difference is that you need to include an exclamation mark before the square brackets and the parentheses. I'm going to use the Pluto logo as an example, but feel free to experiment with some other image. As a best practice, images used should be hosted online, as opposed to being saved locally on your hard drive. This is a static image, so nothing happens if you click on it. You can create a clickable image link by combining the syntax for the hyperlink and the syntax for an image. All you need to do is copy the code for the image and paste it in between the square brackets. Don't forget to include that exclamation mark. And then copy the code for the link and paste it in between the parentheses. When you click on the second image, it will take you to Pluto's GitHub page. Finally, let's take a look at how to embed a YouTube video into your notebook. In order to do this, you need to inject HTML code. You can get the embed code by right-clicking on any YouTube video and selecting the Copy Embed Code option. And then you can paste that code in between the pair of triple quotes. Now, when you do that, the video may be too large for your notebook. You can play around with the width and height settings. I'm just going to cut the values for width and height in half. For a true meta experience, you can now learn about the Pluto Notebook by watching a video about the Pluto Notebook directly from your Pluto Notebook. Let's save this file by scrolling all the way up to the top and selecting the option to save it as a .jl file. In addition, let's save this file as a static HTML file. You can only have one active Pluto Notebook open at a time, so if you ever need to refer to this cheat sheet file, it might be handy to have a static HTML version of it that you can open up in your browser at any time. In fact, let's do that now. Even though you can't make any changes to this HTML version, you can still use the links. And you can even watch the video. This is basically a static website that you can host on a web server. Now, the HTML version is a much larger file compared to the .jl file, so you might not want to save an HTML version for every notebook. But it is convenient, especially if you need to have multiple notebooks open at once for reference. Going back to the active notebook, you can get back to the Pluto welcome page by clicking on the Pluto logo. Now that we know how to use Markdown, let's learn how to use LaTeX. But first, this important message from our sponsor. Socrates once said, "Learning is not about the pursuit of wisdom. It's about the merch." Socrates never said that. Before creating a new notebook, notice that the file listed under the My Work section is some notebook with a random title. That's actually the Markdown cheat sheet notebook that we just created. As you can see, it's the notebook that we just saved, but it's using the default styling. Let's create a new notebook and title it Pluto LaTeX Cheat Sheet. Lesson number 1 is you can display the highly stylized LaTeX simply by using the word LaTeX, following a backslash, wrapped in a pair of $signs. Again, this is optional, but I'm going to customize this user interface. Here are some basic rules when using LaTeX syntax inside of Pluto. We'll cover each of these topics in this section. Normal Markdown is considered text mode. And this is what text looks like inside of math mode. Any text in between the $signs will use the highly stylized font, and all of the white space will be ignored. You can display text inside of math mode by using \text, followed by a pair of curly brackets. As you can see, the font is no longer italicized, and it displays all of the white space. The text is also centered, so this is another way to center your text, as long as you're okay with the font. This is what numbers look like in text mode. And this is what numbers look like in math mode. By default, math mode is center justified. You can left justify your math equations by leaving a blank space before the first $sign. You can also include your math equations in line. The plus sign and the minus sign will work just like you expect them to, but the multiplication sign and the division sign are different. As you can see, LaTeX interprets the lowercase letter x as the variable x and not as a multiplication sign. You can display the multiplication sign by using \times. Similarly, you can display a division sign by using \div. In order to display fractions, use \frac immediately followed by two pairs of curly brackets. The first pair of curly brackets is for the numerator, and the second pair is for the denominator. You can display the square root sign by using \sqrt immediately followed by a pair of curly brackets. The syntax for the cube root sign is not what you might expect. It's basically the same as the square root syntax, with the addition of a pair of square brackets in the middle. You can use whatever number you want in between the square brackets. For exponents, use the caret character. There's no need to use a backslash. And for subscripts, use the underscore character. Again, no need to use a backslash. As we saw earlier, you can use $$ in order to display a $sign in text mode. But in math mode, you need to use \text$. Notice how different the 0 looks between text mode and math mode. When using zeros in your documentation, be aware of the differences between the lowercase letter o, the uppercase letter O, the 0 in text mode, and the 0 in math mode. As you can see, the lowercase letter o and the text mode 0 look very similar. If you need to use 0 in your notebook, it's probably best to use the math mode 0 for clarity. In math mode, you can enter multiple lines by using a begin-end block. The syntax you enter in between the curly brackets will depend on the situation. In this example, I'm going to use gather to group a couple of lines of text. Finally, in math mode, you need to use two backslash characters to force a new line. I know that's a lot to take in, but it'll get easier with some practice. In order to get some practice, let's take a look at some example equations. Let's start with the Pythagorean theorem. Not too bad, right? Okay, let's try the equation for the area of a circle. You can use backslash followed by the name of the letter for any Greek letter, not just pi. Here's an example where you might need to use text inside of math mode. Sign is common enough that you can use \sign in order to display it without being italicized. You can also use \cos for cosine and \tan for tangent. This next example is the quadratic formula, which is the solution to a quadratic equation. At first, the syntax may look complicated, but you've seen most of the syntax already. The only thing new here is \PM, which is short for the plus or minus sign. Here's an example from calculus that you'll become more familiar with later on in the series. Don't worry if you don't understand it now. This tutorial is simply about learning LaTeX typesetting and not about learning calculus. The only new syntax here is \lim, which is immediately followed by an underscore character and a pair of curly brackets. There are 3 entries inside. The first entry is for the variable before the arrow. The second entry is for the arrow itself. And the third entry is for the value that comes after the arrow. Otherwise, the rest of the equation is just a fraction. This next example shows one way to align multiple lines of equations by using a begin-end block. This example shows how to align the equations along the right-hand side. There are several different ways to align equations using LaTeX, but we'll cover those other methods as they come up throughout this tutorial series. Finally, let's take a look at some Greek letters. We've already seen pi, but here are some other examples. With Markdown, you need to use tab completion to display the Unicode characters. In math mode, there's no need for tab completion, but you do need to use \space if you want to include white space in between the characters. And that's it. I know we covered a lot today, but this is just scratching the surface of LaTeX. The good news is that LaTeX has been around for a long time, so there's a good chance that you'll be able to find an answer to your LaTeX question simply by doing a Google search. But this is enough for us to get started, so let's stop here, save this file both as a .jl file and as an HTML file, and then let's recap what we just learned. Hopefully, after this tutorial, you can begin to see some of the differences between a notebook programming environment versus a conventional programming environment, like a text editor. The notebook programming environment is really a documentation environment first, and then a coding environment second. The notebook environment is ideal for smaller, more reflective projects, since it allows you to record your thoughts and to document your experiments. In this way, it's the digital successor to the traditional paper-bound lab notebook. But unlike a paper-bound lab notebook, a digital notebook also allows you to include code snippets that can be used to perform calculations and to test your theories, which will hopefully assist you as you try to discover new things. In the next tutorial, we'll get an introduction to how to use Julia code inside of a Pluto notebook. We'll also take a look at some of the tools that come included with Pluto that will help us in our learning process. That tutorial should be very interesting, so I hope to see you then. If you made it this far, congratulations! If you enjoyed this video and you feel like you learned something new, then please consider smashing that like button, leaving a comment, sharing this video, and subscribing to this channel. If you'd like to support the educational work that I'm doing, please consider making a purchase at the Doggo.jl online store. You can browse through a wide selection of Doggo.jl merch by clicking on the Store tab. For one-time donations, please consider using the Super Thanks button. For ongoing support, please consider joining and becoming a channel member. Channel members get early access to all of my new videos. Early access videos do not contain YouTube ads. New tutorials are posted on Sundays/Mondays. Thanks for watching, and good luck on your Julia journey.